book is called Righteous Porkchop. So you gotta know that. My talk is called, I'll say these slides. Okay. My talk is called Eating as We Farm and Farming as We Eat. I think just about everybody knows now that the American diet is unhealthy today. Increasingly, it is being recognized that the way America is farming today is unhealthy as well. I'm going to talk about the way farming and our diet has changed over the past century, what it looks like today, and what we need to do to fix both of those systems, and they need to be fixed together. A lot of the facts I will present will surprise you. Let's start by looking at the unhealthy American diet. This is probably most clearly expressed through our diet-related diseases. And most importantly, Americans are now drastically overweight. 2/3 of Americans are overweight, and the actual obesity rate, which is the highest, the most overweight, that rate has doubled in the last 3 decades. 33% of Americans now have hypertension, and heart disease, which causes 42% of U.S. deaths every year, is the leading cause of death. Now compare that to the beginning of the 20th century when only about 8% of Americans died from heart disease. So that's a huge difference, obviously. At the same time, however, our spending for food has gone way down. In the beginning of the 20th century, we were spending about 25% of our incomes on food. That actually went up to 31% mid-century, but now it's down to only 9%. At the same time, our food waste has gone way up as well. It's at record highs. Nearly half of the food that is produced in the United States today is never consumed. It's thrown away. And the single largest component of our garbage in the United States is food. Our calories, and this is probably the most important statistic I'm going to present today, so if you don't remember any other statistics, try to remember this one. Our calorie consumption has actually gone up by 523 calories in the last 3 decades. That's obviously an enormous increase. The majority of that caloric increase comes from snacking, not meals. Fast food now accounts for 34% of our total calories that we consume. And our grain consumption has risen dramatically. In the last 3 decades, it's gone up almost 50%. Added sweeteners are also way, way up. From 1900 to 2000, it actually increased by 60%. And in the last 3 decades, just those decades alone, it went up by about 20%. Interestingly, beet and cane sugar consumption has gone down, while high fructose corn syrup has skyrocketed. The consumption of high fructose corn syrup in the last 3 decades has increased by 10,000%. We're eating way too little fruits and vegetables. We're actually increasing the consumption of that, interestingly enough, but we're still way below recommended levels. We're at 45% for vegetables of recommended levels. And of the vegetables we do eat in the United States, about 1/3 of that is made up of iceberg lettuce, potato chips, and French fries. So maybe those shouldn't even be counted at all. And our fruit consumption is less than half of USDA recommended levels. Now, overall, our animal products are lower that we're consuming. This surprises a lot of people. But our poultry and our cheese consumption are way up. Our chicken consumption has gone from 15 pounds to 80 pounds in the last over the century, and our turkey consumption increased by 14 times. Our cheese consumption increased from 4 pounds to 32 pounds from the beginning of the century to today. So cheese and turkey and chicken have gone way up. But other animal products, our consumption is far lower now than it was much of the early part of the 20th century. Beef, for example, we consume 10 pounds less per person annually now. Veal is down 90%, lamb is down 80%, and pork consumption is down by about 12 pounds since the beginning of the century. That really surprises a lot of people because everybody thinks we're just eating more and more red meat and meat in general. That's just not true. Red meat in particular has gone way down in the last few decades. It went down 17%, our red meat consumption in the last few decades, and beef especially went down by 22% in the last 3 decades. Those are really important things to keep in mind because that's really counter to what we keep thinking and hearing about the way we're eating and how it's changed over time. corresponding with this decrease in animal product consumption has been a decrease in total saturated fat consumption. We're consuming about 21% less saturated fat now than we did at the beginning of the 20th century. But, and this is really a really important point, our overall consumption of fats is higher because we're eating a lot more vegetable fats. So our added fat consumption is about double now what it was at the beginning of the 20th century. And to get a little bit more specific about, and this shows that fact right there. The total fats are up, vegetable fats are way up, animal fats are way down. And looking a little more closely at animal fats, here's a picture that shows whole milk consumption. The whole milk consumption in the last few decades has gone down by 73%. Our lard consumption has gone down 47%. Our butter consumption down 15%. Meanwhile, our vegetable oil consumption since over the decade, is up 400%. Now, this slide shows you would expect with our saturated fat consumption down so much and animal consumption down, we would have a declining lines showing for hypertension and heart disease, et cetera. This slide shows that those are actually still level or even going up, all of those conditions. Now, I just want to mention breastfeeding. The levels are low in the United States. About 20% of children are breastfed at 6 months or older. And the significance of that is that it is increasingly believed that formula is connected to obesity and many other diet-related diseases. Now, let's take a look at American agriculture and what's unhealthy about American agriculture. First of all, historically, agriculture has not been a major polluter. It wasn't environmentally perfect, but it was not a major source of pollution. Animals were kept in small herds. Grass was the foundation. Flocks and herds were allowed to be outside and were scattered around the country. This quote from a 1953 book about agriculture talks about the fact that for the first century, the United States was an agricultural nation. It was the most important industry, it was the most important political force, and it was the most important part of the labor force by far. That changed dramatically over the course of the 20th century and is even more so true today. Now, I argue that because of that divorce that we now have from the land, agriculture has changed into an industrial function, and there are a lot of negative side effects from that. First of all, water pollution. Agriculture is the #1 cause of water pollution in the United States today. Agricultural runoff, an important component of that pollution, is now a cause of many problems, including a New Jersey-sized dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Soil erosion. Soil is probably our single most valuable natural resource in the United States, and soil erosion is happening so rapidly. It's about 30 times faster than the natural reformation rate of soil is what we're losing every year, and so we are literally losing our most important natural asset. David Pimentel, a Cornell University food ecologist, says that other than overpopulation, soil erosion is the single greatest threat to humans being able to feed themselves going into the future. Air pollution and global warming are also substantial problems with today's modern methods of agriculture. Let's look a little more specifically now at some of the changes in U.S. farming. The farms are, we all have kind of heard this, we all know this, farms are much larger today. The average size farm in 1900 was about 150 acres, and today it's about 420 acres. There are far fewer farms and far fewer farmers. So at the beginning of the century, there were about 6 million farms, and there are about 2 million farms today. And most importantly, we have far fewer farmers. In 1790, 90% of Americans were farmers. By 1900, about 41% of Americans were farmers, and today, fewer than 1% of Americans are farmers. That has a lot of implications. This part of what's happening as well is the de-ruralization of our country, and that means that there are just fewer and fewer people living in rural areas. Only 17% of Americans live in rural areas today. We've also seen, corresponding with this, a dramatic drop in farm income. So only about 30% of farmers had off-farm income in 1930. They didn't need it otherwise. Today, about 93% of farmers do. They're just not making enough money. And the average farmer, USDA just reported this year that the average farmer makes about 11 cents per food dollar. So they're just not making a living at it. Now, farm people have been replaced by fossil fuels, first of all. Fossil fuels are used both directly and indirectly in agriculture. The total energy expenditure of agriculture during the course of the second half of the 20th century actually increased by fourfold. So we're using a lot more fossil fuels today. And indirectly, we are using it, directly, we are using it in mechanization. So all the automation, the plowing, planting, harvesting, et cetera, machinery, that takes up about 20% of farms' energies. And even more important, much more important, is the indirect use of fossil fuels. And those are the agricultural chemicals, the fertilizers, the pesticides, the herbicides, and the fungicides. Now, the interesting thing, fertilizers is the biggest piece of this. And the interesting thing about fertilizers is that just fertilizers alone take up 31% of farming's energy. And fertilizers were actually invented way back in 1830, but were barely used until after World War II. After World War II, all the munitions plants, many of them, were converted into fertilizer producers. And then the use of agricultural fertilizer doubled. And by 2004, it peaked at 23 million tons a year. Now, pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides altogether are about 1.1 billion pounds a year annually, so very significant as well. All of those are made up of fossil fuels. And finally, the pharmaceutical usage of agriculture is another way that people have been replaced. It replaces animal husbandry with drugs. And FDA has just reported that 80% of the antibiotics that are used in the United States today go to farm animals, 90% of which are not even animals that are sick. It's just used in order to keep them in very crowded conditions. Let's take a quick look at what agriculture looks like today. Here's a hog waste disposal system. It's basically just dumping it out on the land. A lot of this ends up in the waters and in the air, polluting the environment. This is a hog factory. This is the ventilation and automated feeding system of a hog operation. Very typical, probably would have around 20 to 30,000 pigs in it. This is a egg-laying hen operations ventilation system. There are about 1 million hens in that building. This is the inside of the building where those hens are. They're kept in battery cages in tiny, very cramped conditions. This is a typical chicken operation. It would have around 100,000 chickens. This is a typical turkey operation today. It has around 30,000 turkeys. This is a confinement dairy. Almost all of California's dairies are this way. And the size now is very typically around 10,000 or more cows. And there's another picture of that. Here's the inside of hog operations. Again, a typical operation would have 30 or 40,000 hogs in it. Here's what the sows, these are the conditions they live in, and these are what pregnant sows are kept in these cages. They're called gestation crates, and here's what they look like when they give birth, the farrowing crates. They are never allowed to interact with their piglets other than through those metal bars. And there's another picture of that. This is what agriculture looks like today in this country due to industrialization. Now, interestingly, the numbers of animals on farms today is not that different. And this is very surprising and counterintuitive. The total number of work animals, for example, in the United States, it was at 22 million at the beginning of the century. Now it's about 3 million, so it's way down. Beef cattle, a little bit higher, from 44 million at the beginning of the century to 59 million today. But dairy cows are way down. There were 41 million, and now it's down to 9 million today. Pigs went from 80 million, that was kind of the peak in the first half of the 20th century, and now pig numbers are about 65 million. Sheep are from 46 million at the beginning of the century to 5 million today. So the numbers are way, way down, and that really surprises people. The reason for that is because we're using hormones and antibiotics to stimulate much, much faster unnatural growth, and we can get the animals to market much faster. So we can actually produce more meat and dairy, and dairy cattle, of course, are given hormones to do this as well, and have and produce more food with fewer animals. Animals are also slaughtered at far younger ages today. Now, the exception to this is poultry. Chickens and turkeys, as I mentioned about per capita consumption being way up, the numbers of animals are way up too. There are about 200 times as many chickens in the United States today as there were at the beginning of the 20th century, and there are about 15 times as many turkeys. Now, this has also been accompanied, all of these changes in agriculture, by segmentation and monoculture. So we now have animals that are totally divorced from the land. They're not integrated into a multi-crop system or any kind of rotational system. They're actually literally not on the land. They're in buildings their whole lives. And we've seen farms are totally specialized now. So at 1900, the average farm had 5 different crops on it. And today, the average farm has 1 crop on it. In fact, that's what almost all farms have now, is just 1 single crop. Now, you might think that we need to do all this because we desperately need to produce enough food to feed people. And that is just one of the biggest myths of agriculture. This quote from a book called American Farm Policy talks about the fact that overproduction is the single greatest problem that American agriculture has had for the entire 20th century. Now, I put together this little formula that summarizes the situation. Subsidies plus industrial methods equals overproduction and underemployment, which equals cheap food, which equals overeating, waste, and pollution. We need a return to common sense for food and farming. We need farm policy that is focused on employment rather than production. And here's a quote from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food. He talks about the fact that we need to decouple oil from food production, and we need to have a more diverse agriculture to ensure that appropriate nutrients are being produced for people. Better eating in the United States means more fruits and vegetables. We actually don't produce enough fruits and vegetables right now to meet USDA dietary guidelines. We need far less sweetener to be produced. We're actually subsidizing sugar to the tune of $4 billion a year. And corn, which produces high fructose corn syrup, has been subsidized at the rate of $80 billion for the past 15 years. Why are we doing this? And we need far less grain in our diet, so we shouldn't be subsidizing grain so heavily as well. It's the single biggest source of subsidies. We need less and better animal products. Pasture-based animal products are environmentally far superior. They're safer, they're healthier, they're higher in beneficial amino acids, lower in saturated fat. This is what the farms look like that my husband and I work with. These farmers are diversified. They do not rely on confinement buildings, drugs, or chemicals. They rely on human skill and knowledge and human labor. They allow animals to engage in their natural behaviors. This is our farm. Like the farmers we work with, we allow our animals to engage in natural behaviors. We feed them natural diets. We don't use chemicals, drugs, or confinement buildings. And we take extremely careful care of the land and the waters and everything that our environment, that everything that we do, how it affects the environment. We are producing, we believe, safe, healthy food for this generation and the next.